Somewhere between 50,000 and 40,000 years ago, this planet had more than one kind of human walking on it at the same time. Not ancestors, not early drafts of us, actual other species of human, alive, hunting, raising families, right alongside Homo sapiens. Today, there's exactly one human species left, you. So what happened to all the others? This isn't a story about cavemen slowly evolving into modern humans in a straight line. It's stranger than that. For most of our history, we shared this planet with other humans, some nearly identical to us, some built for entirely different worlds. One stood barely 3 feet tall, one is known almost entirely from a single finger bone, and one outlasted every species on this list combined, only to vanish anyway. This is the real story of the other humans, and why, out of all of them, we're the ones still here. Let's start with the species that lasted longest of all. Homo erectus. They showed up around 2 million years ago. To put that in perspective, every city humans have ever built, every war, every language, all of it fits inside the last few thousand years. Homo erectus existed for a stretch of time so long that our entire recorded history is basically a footnote next to theirs. Their bodies were the first to actually look human. Long legs, shorter arms, a frame built for walking and running across open ground. They were almost certainly the first human species to ever leave Africa, spreading into landscapes and climates their bodies had never evolved for. Their brains were smaller than ours, but far bigger than anything that came before them. And their stone tools barely changed for hundreds of thousands of years. That might sound like a lack of imagination, but it's actually the opposite. What they built worked so well there was no pressure to change it, but their final chapter tells a different story. Their last known populations ended up isolated on the island of Java in Indonesia, cut off from the mainland, with nowhere left to expand into. The forests they depended on started shrinking. The animals they hunted became harder to find, and without enough space or enough numbers to recover, a species that had survived for almost 2 million years slowly ran out of options. Their last confirmed fossils date to around 110,000 years ago. After outlasting nearly everything the planet could throw at them, Homo erectus was gone. Now let's talk about the Neanderthals, probably the most misunderstood species in human history. For decades, they were written off as dumb, brutish cavemen. That image was always wrong, and the more research comes in, the more wrong it gets. Neanderthals were built for survival in ways that are hard to overstate. Compact, powerful bodies, wide chests, thick bones, strong arms, heavy brow ridges, and larger noses that warmed freezing air before it hit their lungs. Their brains were on average slightly larger than ours. They hunted massive, dangerous animals at close range, which is why their skeletons show injury patterns almost identical to modern rodeo riders. They controlled fire, they made sophisticated tools, and there's growing evidence they buried their dead with care. Neanderthals lived across Europe and Western Asia for more than 300,000 years. But around 45,000 years ago, Homo sapiens started moving into the exact same territory. For a few thousand years, the two species actually lived side by side, and DNA proves they had children together. But sharing the landscape with Homo sapiens created new pressure. Both species hunted the same animals and relied on the same land. Homo sapiens lived in larger groups with wider social networks, meaning they could share resources and knowledge across long distances. Neanderthals generally lived in smaller, more isolated groups, which made it much harder to recover when things went wrong. At the same time, the climate kept swinging between brutal cold and warmer periods, reshaping the environment again and again. Neanderthal populations shrank and became more isolated, and their DNA shows unusually low genetic diversity, a sign their numbers were already in trouble. By around 40,000 years ago, they vanished from the fossil record entirely, not from one single event. From a slow combination of competition, climate pressure, and shrinking numbers that eventually became unrecoverable. Then there are the Denisovans, a species so mysterious we can barely even see them. The entire discovery started with a single finger bone, pulled out of a cave in the Altai Mountains of Siberia. A fragment small enough to fit in the palm of your hand. When scientists extracted DNA from it, the results didn't match anything on record, not Neanderthal, not Homo sapiens, not anything previously known. It was something else entirely. A whole branch of the human family that had been hiding in the genetic record the entire time. Since that discovery, only a handful of additional remains have ever turned up. A few teeth, a jawbone fragment found high on the Tibetan plateau, and not much else. And yet their genetic footprint is massive. Denisovan ancestry shows up today across populations in Asia and Oceania, with some groups in Melanesia carrying as much as 6% Denisovan DNA. Tibetans inherited a specific Denisovan gene that lets them function at extreme altitudes, where most human bodies would start to fail. A species we can barely find in the ground is still shaping how living people survive in thin air right now. As a living population, the Denisovans faded out somewhere around 30,000 years ago. Their range may have stretched vast in duckworks, but their numbers were likely thin. And thin populations rarely survive when the world shifts underneath them. And then there's maybe the strangest chapter of all. In 2003, on the Indonesian island of Flores, researchers uncovered the remains of a human species unlike anything seen before, barely a meter tall with a brain roughly the size of a grapefruit. At first, plenty of scientists were skeptical. Some argued the bones belonged to a modern human with a disease or a developmental disorder. But as more evidence surfaced, it became clear. This was a completely separate species, Homo floresiensis. This tiny human lived on Flores alongside Komodo dragons, giant storks, and dwarf elephants. Islands do strange things to evolution. When a species is isolated long enough, it can shift dramatically. Large animals shrink, small animals grow. Homo floresiensis may be one of the most extreme examples of that process in our entire family tree. Their fossils date from roughly 100,000 to 60,000 years ago, and stone tools suggest they may have held on until around 50,000 years ago. And here's the detail that stands out. Modern humans were arriving in that exact region around the same time. Nobody knows exactly what happened. But on a small island, a species doesn't need a massive catastrophe to disappear. Sometimes a small population facing new pressure simply runs out of time. So why are we the only human species left? The obvious answer is intelligence. But that falls apart fast. Neanderthals were intelligent. Denisovans adapted to some of the harshest environments on Earth. Homo erectus outlasted us several times over, and Homo floresiensis survived conditions that would terrify a modern person. What might have actually separated us is something harder to measure. The way we built connections across distance. Homo sapiens didn't just live in groups. We built networks, tools, techniques, and knowledge moved between communities in ways that don't seem to have happened for any other species at the same speed or scale. When one group faced a crisis, what they'd learned didn't die with them. It had already traveled somewhere else. When the climate shifted and entire regions became unlivable, our species had the flexibility to reorganize because we were never locked into one place or one strategy, but even that only explains part of it. Luck, geography, and just being in the right place. With enough numbers at the right moment played a role too. We weren't destined to be the last ones standing. We just happened to be. The other human species weren't early drafts of us. They weren't stepping stones on some ladder toward becoming Homo sapiens. They were their own kinds of human, each with a completely different way of surviving the world. Homo erectus survived for nearly 2 million years and still disappeared. Neanderthals endured hundreds of thousands of years of ice age extremes and still vanished. The Denisovans left behind almost no fossils at all, and yet traces of their DNA are inside people alive right now. For most of human history, we were just one branch of a much larger family. Now, we're the only one left. And if this changed how you think about human history, subscribe and tell me in the comments which species surprised you the most, the ones 3 feet tall or the ones we only know from a single finger bone.